All right, now I call upon Professor Kaushik Basu to formally release the inaugural issue of the Jindal Journal of Public Policy. I request both the editors to join us on this occasion.
It's really a great pleasure for me to be here. I know for a lot of you, this is a special day, as I'm discovering that for several of your faculty, this is the first day in this job, first at least proper working day in this job. For me, this is the first day out of my job that I've been doing for quite some time. So this is indeed a very, very special day for me. What Raj just mentioned is indeed true, that when I worked on this commission for higher education, I made an argument which actually had to be a dissent note because there wasn't consensus on that for the university system and higher education system in India to take off, you need the state sector in a big way. But you also need the private sector in a big way. And I personally am in favor of both the for-profit private sector and non-profit private sector to play a role. You know, when it comes to for-profit private sector, there are some prominent examples in the United States. University of Phoenix is a for-profit private sector. So it's like a company being run. Someone's just making profits openly out of that. People will come and tell me that, look, I mean, the for-profit universities are never terribly good because the student quality is not good. But to me, given that a majority of students in a country will not be good students, to have a sector that absorbs this is a very, very useful social function. The best universities that we've seen actually around the world are a combination of state universities and not-for-profit private universities. And that's why I actually keep track, because of my interest in higher education, of universities and what's happening on the higher education front. And I feel that in India the scope for not-for-profit but private institutes and universities is immense. You look around and these are India's first years sort of finding its feet in this. And it's not always heartening what you see, but there was one particular university that I was watching for a while and I felt that this one is special, and this is actually the O.P. Jindal University. I knew very little about it, but when I got to see a couple of your journals from other disciplines, not the journal that was just inaugurated, it was immediately evident that this is a serious private university in serious academic business. And for me, this is extremely heartening. One more indicator. I feel India's architecturally, we are too conventional, whereas architectural creativity is an essential part of creativity. And when I first saw the pictures of your university with a slightly bird cagey kind of look from a distance, it immediately struck me. Actually, I felt it has a French element to it because of the Georges Pompidou Center in Paris. It sort of reminded me. And I felt very good that a university being creative in terms of the space and architecture, all these things added up. And then I met Raj just a couple of months ago for the first time. And it was just, I was completely convinced that this is a very, very special venture. And a lot of what can happen in India in the future really is tied up with this, and Raj's energy and academic interest, intellectual achievements, just phenomenal. I consider myself energetic and hardworking, but every time I interact with him, I feel I should take some energy pills to step up my level of activity and pace. When it comes to the faculty, this also I didn't know. People I've known from many, many years ago, Shiv Vishwanathan over here, Sudarshan from years ago, Asim, with whom I've actually worked with, Asim Prakash, Vegard Iverson over here, Prakash Chandra, who's not here but whom I've known from a long time, and over the last 2.5 years with Rajiv Malhotra, I've worked very, very closely. So in fact, much to my surprise, It was almost as if the school was being formed by raiding my friends rather than a university. Because so many of my friends and acquaintances from many years ago are here together. So once again, congratulations for this very, very important venture. Also public policy, I should tell you, I was there on the founding occasion of the Lee Kuan Yew School in Singapore. I was at the commencement ceremony over there. As a professor at Cornell, I had gone there. And I had felt that in emerging economies, especially an emerging economy like India, this is a very, very big lacuna, that we don't have a good public policy school because the interface between regular academic disciplines, sort of where you do research, and with public policy and strategic public policy is very weak in India. And the United States in particular, where I've actually lectured, I've given full courses both at the Kennedy School and at the Woodrow Wilson School, it was very evident that these places play an absolute critical role for the United States. And I'm once again glad, not just for your university, but particularly for the School of Government and Public Policy. Did I get that right? The order of that? Yeah, that has been set up and is starting out over here. And India's institutes, as that was Sudarshan, Raj was saying about presidency. I can tell you that this is a bit of a general problem across India, because when he said Presidency College without naming the city, I thought he's going to talk about the other Presidency College, which also is a very, very visible drop from its remarkable status, the Presidency College, Calcutta. So India, which had a head start in terms of higher education and the university system, has not done well in this sector. And so it's not just the Chennai presidency, Calcutta presidency stands very similarly. It's now trying to revive. There's a lot of energy and effort being put into it, but it is high time. You know, I'm going to speak today about the larger domain of economics, public policy, social development. That's the interface that I want to talk about. But I want to tell you one important lesson that I take away from my 2.5 years, nearly 3 years in government. The importance of higher education. This is easy to not realize the importance of this. And as a professor, I did not appreciate the importance of this. John Maynard Keynes, the guru of my field, economics, in the last chapter of his famous book, The General Theory, has this very beautiful, Keynes was a writer. I mean, apart from being an economist, he wrote beautifully. There are these couple of lines where Keynes says that in the end, it's knowledge and ideas which drive a nation. Vested interests that we keep talking about. This is happening because of vested interests. This is not happening because of vested interests. Keynes said that those are important, but in the long run, the power of ideas way surpass the power of vested interests. As a professor, I used to think of these lines as lovely lines, but exactly what you would expect from a professor, because a professor has a vested interest in exactly that point of view, to push the importance of ideas. Having come into government and tried implementing new policies, I'm completely convinced that a much bigger stumbling block in getting new ideas into place, into getting good policies moving, is ideas rather than vested interests. Vested interests are there, but you can very often bulldoze over those vested interests. But when ideas get set and old-fashioned and fundamentalist, it's very difficult to bring about change. And that's where really the biggest, if India is going to have a great future, fiscal policy is important, monetary policy is important, but higher education, irreverential creativity. I mean, creativity is irreverential. You'll have to question everything that you're learning. You have to cast doubts on everything conventional view that is given to you. That is what needs to be nurtured. And actually, if you look back at history, the great civilizations that came up, economic success goes hand in hand with the space for ideas, space for universities or academies. I don't know the causal direction, but it does seem to me that unless this space for ideas, creativity is really the crux of it, is nurtured, a country would not do well even economically. So creativity is good in itself. I mean, even if you did not do well materially, just creativity is an excellent pursuit. But I feel actually even economic development is very, very closely linked with it. And just look at history, look at Greece. Alexander plundering the world, making money, becoming very, very wealthy for that region. But that is also the region of Socrates, that is the region of Plato, that is the region of Aristotle, and a couple of 100 years before that, it's the region of Pythagoras. People in the complete front line of ideas at that time, developing ideas, nurturing ideas. Come a little bit later to Alexandria, Cleopatra, big amounts of money and wealth being assembled. But Alexandria is also the city of Archimedes, the city of Euclid, people who are generating ideas. Come to Italy in the heydays, 15th century, early 16th century, Florence, with the Medicis minting money, I mean just flourishing business. But lots of people wouldn't even today even know of the Medicis. And indeed, the dominant figures of that time would be Machiavelli, generating ideas on public policy and governance. I mean, he was the guru of that. There was Da Vinci, Michelangelo, creativity in art is flourishing. If you think of Britain in its heydays, it's a global power, global powerful economy, but it's also the seat of high learning. Oxford, Cambridge, a whole bunch of universities flourishing and generating ideas. The United States, we typically think of United States as a dominant global economic power, a military power, those things are true. But actually the bigger achievement of the United States is the space it has created for higher education, research, and the centrality given to that. And if you actually look at the dominance of United States today in the space of research, it's bigger than America's dominance in the space of the economy or even defense. There are other countries which are coming up close to US in those, but even to date, in the space of just knowledge creation, United States dominates. I feel India, having had this initial lead, and it is indeed a lead by emerging country standards. If you think of India in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it was a remarkable place by emerging country standards. It was nurturing higher education. It had a somewhat peculiar system. We did very poorly in terms of basic literacy. Vast numbers of Indians did not get any education, which is shameful, absolutely. But those who got education got very good education through the 60s, 70s, 80s. India is beginning to slack off. We are more or less continuing with the same system with very few new ideas coming in, and you can see that in this space of higher education, China has come up in a very big way, Malaysia has come up in a big way, Latin American countries are investing in a big way. It is time for India to wake up, and once again, I'm going back to the theme that I'm just glad that there is this effort going on. I wanted to talk, as I said, around the topic of economics. That's about the only thing I do in life, economics, so I can't go too far away from that. But the non-economic determinants of a country's economic performance, and in some sense that's what I was telling you just now about human capital and higher education, but let me just go a little bit beyond that. There is a small body of research in economics, and let me put on my academic hat from here onwards. I have, after all, as of last night, stepped out of government and heading back into academe. So let me venture into the kinds of areas that I used to work on. An economy doing well, yes, depends very, very critically on the government. The government has to create good fiscal policies. I don't know whether we've done good fiscal policies or bad fiscal policies. I've been closely associated with the fiscal policies that came out of India over the last 2.5 years. We need good monetary policies, but we also need political institutions, the right political institutions. We need laws which are well crafted, and I hope I will come into that, not just for legal justice and fairness, but for economic development. You need well-crafted laws. You need certain kinds of social norms to be in place. And when you put these non-economic variables together, I feel actually in the end, more important than getting your economic policies right is having this structure around economics of social norms, the right kinds of laws, the right kinds of governance structures are critically important. Once you have those in place, an economy begins to move on its own. And in India, we haven't given enough importance to these surrounding fields, the surrounding space, which makes for better economic progress. And not just in India, actually. It's partly a fault of the economics profession that there hasn't been enough importance given to this. Francis Fukuyama has written about trust and economic development. That a society in which there is a lot of trust among individuals, those societies tend to do better. Now, hardcore econometricians will not be pleased about Fukuyama's result because Fukuyama does not establish this with statistics, but he makes broad brush cross-country comparisons and points to the fact that societies that have managed to develop a lot of trust among people have done well. Scandinavian countries, very high in terms of interpersonal trust. East Asian countries, very high in terms of trust. In India, there is something interesting. We are very trustworthy within our networks. So friends, communities, even a bit going by class, there is a lot of trust. When it's a cluster that know each other, there's a lot of trust. You can depend on people. You can leave a bag of cash and say, keep charge of it for the next 1 year and then give it back to me. You can do it among friends, the network. But our anonymous trust is very low. No getting away from that. I mean, you can whitewash these things, but our anonymous trust is low. That if you don't know the person, the trust level is low. Fortunately, to discuss these is not politically incorrect because of my own personal belief that there is absolutely nothing which is hardwired in a society or a nation for this to be inherently a part of that society. There are many of these cultural norms which change with the incentives changing, the atmosphere changing, they begin to change. And I've got with me these documents describing Japan 100 years ago. And if you black out the word Japan and any reference to Japan, these are Europeans describing Japanese society. If you read that, you will think of that as India, and I have a remark on India, is about unpunctuality. That's describing Japanese unpunctuality as shockingly high. No one is turning up on time, nothing seems to begin on time. This is Japan. Japan would change dramatically. And Japan is arguably today's most punctual society. In fact, I believe Japan is overdoing it a little bit. It's probably hurting itself through hyper-punctuality. It needs to backtrack a little bit. But it is the most punctual society. Somewhere along the line, along the time, it changed. South Korea. There are South and North Korea. There are descriptions of Korea in the 1950s, British visitors, American visitors, talking about how lazy these people are. They don't work at all. These are Koreans. Koreans today are known to be among the hardest working people, which means this norm has changed over a couple of decades. Punctuality, since I mentioned, I wrote an academic paper with a Swedish game theorist, Jörgen Weibull, on punctuality norms. It was a delight working on this because we found that there is very little written by economists on this. There was a lot written by sociologists, social psychologists, and basically what we were getting is a lot of this was cross-country information, and Jörgen Weibull and I found, which is no surprise at all, that Latin American societies are very unpunctual, North American societies are very punctual, and my co-author Jörgen Weibull indeed comes from a very, very punctual society, Sweden, and I come from a, to put it a bit gently, less punctual society, India. But when we were doing this paper, we were arguing that there is nothing inherent about this norm. These things begin to change once the incentives change in a society. And the first wake-up call I got on this was from just a personal incident which told me how these things can change once the environment changes. Is in 1986, I was visiting Princeton. I mentioned teaching at the Woodrow Wilson School. When at the Woodrow Wilson School, I wanted to meet up with the grand old man of economics, the Nobel laureate Arthur Lewis. The economists in the audience may know about him. His work is fundamental in development economics. Arthur Lewis, and this is important, is a black economist. He's the only black person who's won the Nobel Prize in economics. I went to meet Arthur Lewis, grand old man. I set up an appointment because I had read his books as a student in Delhi University. I went way punctually. I didn't want to keep Arthur Lewis waiting. So, a gentleman, his wife was there because by then he was unwell. I was walked into his room. Arthur Lewis, I came in, Arthur Lewis started talking. And the first thing he said, you know, I wonder what is it that makes you Indians so punctual? And I thought, you know, Arthur Lewis is getting old. Maybe he's beginning to mix up Indians and the Japanese or something like that. His categories are getting confounded. So I was humming and hawing. Then I realized what happened is Arthur Lewis's Indians are the H-1B professional Indians in the United States. They've gone there and they've adapted and they've become punctual very, very quickly. And Arthur Lewis was talking about his own group. He was saying, blacks, I want them to be more punctual in the United States. What is it about Indians? One thing is it's a small group of Indians that have migrated to India, to the US, through this category, and they have changed their behavior. So human behavior and behavior patterns change once the setting begins to change. And actually I have to say on punctuality, I can't give you hard statistics. But my own hunch is in India, punctuality norms are beginning to change. Government of India that I worked on for 2.5 years, and before that as an independent professor I would go occasionally. My hunch is that over the last 20 years there is a distinct improvement in punctuality norms in India. So these kinds of norms do change and a lot really depends on that. Another topic let me come into, which economists give very little importance to, but is very, very critical. And this is very important to understand, especially for economists. In economics, thanks to our old texts, there's a lot of importance given to selfishness and drive and greed. Indeed, there is no getting away from the fact that they play a role in a society's development. If everybody wants to be otherworldly and relinquishes all desires for material progress, that society may have certain achievements in happiness index and other kinds of achievements, but it's unlikely to make economic progress. But what very often, because of this early lesson of economics, what gets left out is there are other also human qualities which are very important, not just in themselves, but for an economy to do well. Because of the drumming in economics textbooks that selfishness plays a role, greed plays a role, most people, of course, like to be conformists. So once you're told that selfishness plays a role and that's the way human beings are, people very often become more selfish. There have been these lovely experiments which were run by my colleague at Cornell, Bob Frank, Tom Gilovich, and a couple of others. Gilovich is from the psychology department, where people of different disciplines, people who have studied law, physics, mathematics, economics, were played games in a laboratory where you can exhibit different levels of selfishness. It was found that economists are the most selfish people in these playing of these games, and people have questioned, is it that selfish people get drawn into economics or economics makes them more selfish? My own hunch is economics makes them more selfish, because in economics you're always told that human beings are always selfish. And once you read that, no one wants to be abnormal. If everyone is always selfish, I better be a normal person and I better be a bit more selfish. But right from early works by some gurus of economics, Kenneth Arrow, pointing out that altruism, respect for others, these are qualities absolutely fundamental for a market economy. And I feel again in India that these are values that we need to be reminded of. That yes, you do need a drive, you do need to want more. That is an important drive, not that it is something we want to inculcate in anyone. It's a part of human beings. In fact, if anything, we want to inculcate the other way around, not to be too self-driven, but it is there. But you also need altruism, you also need integrity and honesty. On this, there have been these experiments which were, let me give you actually this particular laboratory experiment which was run. This is called a trust game. Can I quickly do a show of hands among the students? How many of you have heard, know what is a trust game? Okay, there's a small smattering of hands. Let me explain the trust game to you. And on these, there were these laboratory experiments that were done on the trust game, and I'll show you just now what happens. A trust game almost mimics a business venture. See, in a business venture, an investor and an entrepreneur, what is the relationship? The relationship usually takes the form, an investor gives money to an entrepreneur, the entrepreneur multiplies that money, you do something, the money becomes larger, and you give back the investor a part of it. When you're doing big investment in life, of course you'll do it contractually. You write down a contract, the courts are there, the courts will enforce it. But life is full of these kinds of ventures where you don't even involve the courts. Unless there is trust among human beings, these investments would not even take place. Because if I'm going to give my money to someone else with the understanding that if and when that person makes money, that person will give it back to me, unless I can trust that person, I would not put in this money. To test the power of trusting, economists and game theorists have developed these games called the trust games. A trust game works as follows. This is literally done in a laboratory. Suppose I'm running a trust game among two of your students. Let me call them A and B, since I don't know your names. This is the way a trust game is played. I give 100 rupees to her, this student A, and I tell her in the laboratory, and this is exactly what's done with actual money. I tell her you can keep the money, in which case that's the end of the game. She's got 100 rupees, that's the end. Or she can invest this money, meaning she can give this money to B, to him, the 100 rupees. As soon as she gives the 100 rupees to him, I as the game organizer, I treble it up. I give him another 200. So if she gives 100 to him, now he has 300 because I've given him 200 as the organizer. So the act of her investing money in him makes the cake become 3 times as large. It is now 300 in his pocket. He is now asked to make a move. He can give back some part or nothing of this money to her. It's his choice. Whatever he does, that's the end of the game. Is the game clear? It's a 2-move game. 100 rupees first, don't count my moves as moves. Those are not moves. As the organizer, I give her 100 rupees. She can now keep it or give part or the whole amount to him. Whatever she gives him, that gets trebled up. Then it's for him to keep a part of it or give it back to her. See, if there is trust in a society, then he will realize that if she did not trust him with the money, he would get nothing. Because only after she gives him money, that money gets trebled up. So if she did not trust him with the money, he would not get anything. So suppose she gives him 100. 100 becomes 300. At one level, he owes something back to her. Otherwise, he would get nothing. In a good society, he would give back a big chunk of that, maybe 150 back to her. So it was worthwhile for her to give the 100 to him because she gets back 150. These games have been played in laboratories around the world. Very important tests were done in United States, and also a bunch of tests were done in Israel. And there are journal papers now with fascinating results. In a society in which there is a lot of trust, do you see that the cake is going to become large? Because in a fully trusting society, the implicit understanding between the two of them will be as follows. She gets the 100, gives the entire 100 over to him, that becomes 300. He gives back 150, 140 to her. They both got roughly 150 each. In a society with no trust, what would happen? Say, take a completely selfish society, a society which is the way textbook economics tells you human beings are. Every penny you try to keep for yourself with nothing for the other person. Tell me now, in this, I'm taking you through a very standard game theoretic reasoning. To see what will happen in this game, this is the way you always analyze these in game theory. You always start with the second player. In game theory, we analyze outcomes by doing backward reasoning. Do a little bit of backward reasoning with me. Suppose she gives any money to him, 50 rupees, which will then become 150 because I'll treble it up. Or she gives 100, it becomes 300. What will he do in the second period when he's been asked, you can give back some, not give back some, it's up to you. If he is completely selfish, tell me what is the right thing for him to do in this second period? Absolutely obvious. That's the end of the game. Whatever he has, he tucks it into his pocket saying, bad luck. You trusted me, but I won't give you anything. So if he's completely selfish and rational, he'll keep the whole thing in his pocket because there's no reason for goodwill with her anymore. The game is over. He walks away. She, if she knows that he's completely rational and selfish, what will she do when I give her the 100 rupees? How much will she give to him? Do you see? She'll give nothing because she knows that he, being rational and selfish, will keep whatever she gives him, he will keep the trebled up amount, so she will give nothing. So in a world which the economists talk about in textbooks, she will give nothing, she will keep the 100 rupees, the economy will be, the two-person economy will be poor with only 100 rupees among them, it won't have 300 rupees. But if they were a trusting society, they would have 300 rupees. A group that has somehow managed to inculcate trust among themselves tend to do better because they can cut deals of this kind. This is what Fukuyama, without going into game theory, was saying, that societies which can trust one another, they can cut many more deals, transactions, businesses, because you can rely on the other side. And those societies begin to flourish. Since Vegard is here, I remember once in Norway, in Bergen, going to a music concert as I was going in with a friend of mine. Outside in an unprotected area, we were asked to put down our bags. We were not allowed to carry our bags into the music program. And hanging a bag outside loaded with stuff, you pretty much give up any hopes of seeing that bag once again. So I hung it up over there, and I remember I sat through that music program, slightly disturbed mind, not expecting it to be there. But I came back and it was, of course, right there. I picked it up, came back. The whole costly process of someone monitoring, giving you tickets or putting them in lockers, you can do away with because there is that trust. If you don't have that trust in society, you run into difficulties because you have to devise schemes. At times you can have clever economic schemes. Before I joined government, the one article of mine that was cited more than any other newspaper article was a bit of a tip to economists on how not to lose your footwear when you visit an Indian temple. When you visit an Indian temple, at least in the olden days, there was no organized way of keeping your footwear. So outside the temple door, you leave your sandals or shoes or whatever, you go into the temple, pray or admire the statuary, depending on your inclination for these things. You come out of the temple, 50-50 chance your footwear would be gone. I had developed a scheme of my own using very standard game theory where everyone is rational. In a rational society, actually the footwear should be gone because it makes sense for others to take away good shoes and run away. So what do you do in a rational society? I had developed a scheme which I had shared with my sisters and friends, which is when you go into an Indian temple, take off one footwear. Indian temples usually have many doors and entrances. So put one footwear in one heap in front of one door, hobble over to another door, put another one there and then go into the temple. You will typically come out and find both your shoes there because one shoe is of no value and thieves usually come very quickly, pick up pairs and run away. This used to work very well for me. Actually, I used to use that and all my relatives were using that. Then I think in Hindustan Times, I wrote an article on how not to lose your footwear when visiting Indian temples, and that became very popular. But again, it's a cumbersome method. Whereas if there is natural trust and certain rules of society which everyone follows, it makes it easier. And I'm giving you trivial examples, but a lot of business and everyday transaction depends on these kinds of trust, and a society begins to do better. These games, which were done in laboratories, very interesting results. In Israel, very famous tests were done, paper published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. It turns out that among Ashkenazi Jews, the level of trust is greater among Sephardic Jews, the level of trust is less. So when you make them play these games repeatedly in laboratories, Ashkenazi Jews trust one another more and they become rich very quickly because their money is being trebled very, very rapidly because they are trusting one another. The Sephardic Jews don't become rich very rapidly because they are not able to trust one another. What you have to realize again is it's very easy to do a politically incorrect analysis of this and say that these things are genetically hardwired. Some people are trustworthy, some people are punctual. I don't think so. I believe in the fundamental similarity of human beings. I mean, I've spent time in societies among even tribal groups in Mexico. You come away feeling that, fundamentally human beings are so similar. It's through history, experience, you develop these different traits. If you've been cheated too many times, you learn not to trust others. So you need a little bit of social thought on how these things can be improved and you can do better. I had several other things to talk about, but actually I wanted to talk about law and economics. So let me jump straight away from social norms to an area of law. Because again, the drafting of legislation is important not just for fairness. If you leave this entirely to lawyers, lawyers will think of fairness, justice, etc. But law and economics, just like social norms and economics, and I'm sorry I spent a disproportionate amount of time on that, just like social norms and economics, there's a lot of interaction, and I've gone on about that, but let me turn to law and economics. Law and economics, the interface is critical for a country's development, and I feel in India there is a lot that needs to be done on law. Our laws are not crafted with enough of economics input into that. In the United States, the field of law and economics is a flourishing field. I mean, there are people that are my colleagues who get called into courts to testify because this is indeed important. I can give you a slew of legislations in India which are so badly drafted that you cannot have economic deals, progress, permission gets thwarted because the law is very, very poorly drafted. So drafting a law, keeping in mind that a law contributes to the development of an economy is very important. Let me again, I am running a bit against time, end with one example of the interface between law and economics where I have actually written and contributed in the academic debate in this field. This is the child labor laws and law. I'm going back to something that I used to work on years ago. Last 3 years I haven't worked on this, haven't spoken about this, but as I was last evening thinking of what I should tell you all about, I thought I will revisit this topic of mine which used to be of great interest to me. In putting an end to child labor, we very often think in terms of legal moves. You ban child labor. I have mixed feelings on these legal moves, and let me explain to you. Mixed feelings does not mean woolly feelings. I think I'm very clear-headed on this, but you have to be very careful about the empirical evidence and setting when you craft a law, and the law has to be crafted very carefully. I got drawn into this subject in a very interesting way. I moved to the United States in 1994. August 1994, I moved to America, and at that time there was a bill that was being debated by the US Congress called the Harkins Bill for banning any product with a child labor input from coming into United States, which means the United States as an importer of goods, if it felt that these shoes coming from India were tainted by child labor, United States would ban the import of these goods into the United States. I wrote a New York Times article for New York Times attacking this law in the United States, saying that this looks like a very progressive law, but it is not a progressive law. Actually, the reason why New York Times, which is not easy to get into, I broke in so easily because of a very interesting discovery. This bill, the American bill against child labor tainted products, had been in public space for a long time. The bill that was being debated in Congress was a very clean bill. Talks about the welfare of the children, that many developing countries, they did not name countries, but countries like India, countries in sub-Saharan Africa had a lot of child labor, Ethiopia, very high child labor, and taking the view that these are countries which were being mean, selfish for more profit and allowing, there's a hint of that, and children need support from United States. I felt that that legislation was not well crafted, and indeed there was an earlier bill which had referred to the worker interest in United States. So it was not as innocuous as it appeared. It was talking in terms of protectionism and cheap products coming in. But my argument there was, and I got a lot of support and a lot of criticism. I said that, look, child labor happens for two reasons. Entrepreneurial greed, very cheap labor, you want to make more profits, you employ them. But there is another reason. It's not parental sloth, as a lot of people in developed countries make it out to be. Developed countries, very often the view is entrepreneurs are greedy and parents are lazy and slothful and they send their children to work. I contested the second assumption. I said that yes, entrepreneurs may be greedy and doing that, very likely that is a factor. But parents, when there is mass child labor, it is not as if they are being lazy and slothful. They are doing it because they have no other alternative. They don't want to starve. They have to send their children out to work. Once you understand that it is extreme poverty that drives people to send their children out to work, you have to be careful when you legislate against child labor. If you don't do anything about poverty and just legislate against child labor, you may be pushing the children from labor into starvation, and you have to be careful about that. I think even today that the warning bell is absolutely important. I do believe, though, India today is at in a situation where it should be banned. India is in a position to be able to take on, but there is one intricate argument involving law and economics here I want to bring in, and I will close with that. I've actually published in law journals and economics journals on this particular topic. There is a situation where the banning of child labor is worthwhile, and this involves a little bit of economic analysis being intertwined with law. See, if you do buy my axiom that parents, when they send their children to work, barring some rare cases of abusive parents, it is desperation. You're very poor, you have no alternative, you send your children to work. Which would immediately mean that if adult wages were higher, then child labor would go down automatically. You would not need the law very much to banish child labor if adult wages began to rise. In the United States, there is a law against child labor. But even if that law was revoked today, and it was said that parents can send their children to labor, there may be a minuscule increase in child labor, but nothing more than that. No one will even think of sending their children to labor for that reason. So it depends a lot on wages. Now, see the following. If you ban child labor in a society and impose it properly, so you have a new bill which says no children can work, all these children will be withdrawn from the labor force. Can you tell me, by using a little bit of intuitive economic reasoning, what will happen to adult wages if all child labor gets withdrawn from the labor force? I know in Ethiopia, I'm giving you a slightly dated figure, 42% of the children work as laborers. In India, the figure used to be 12% or so. I'm assuming by now it will be less, but work as laborers. If you have a law that withdraws, so that this labor is withdrawn, what will happen to adult wages? Adult wages will go up because entrepreneurs will now be forced to compete to hire the adults. If those adult wages go up sufficiently, do you see that you will at one level not need the law, anti-child labor law anymore, because if the adult wages rise sufficiently, it will not be in the parents' interest to send their children out to work anymore. So over here, the law plays a very interesting role. It deflects the economy from a low adult wage equilibrium to a high adult wage equilibrium. Once you get into a high adult wage equilibrium, the law ceases to play a big role, because now the parents on their own don't want to send their children out to work. The law plays the role of deflecting the economy from one equilibrium to another. The law can be used in many different ways to achieve a lot in an economy. This is one field which is very, very weak in India. I know that law is a very important discipline in the OP Jindal University. Law and economics, since you are in an interdisciplinary program, you'll hopefully be able to study a certain amount of sociology, politics, law and economics. So these are a couple of areas gone through hurriedly, where keeping your attention and focus and trying to dig a little bit deeper into the world of knowledge so that we can create better policy will be wonderful. So again, once again, congratulations for this big effort, and to all the students, it's a great place you've joined up, and keep up your morale and enthusiasm. Thank you.